but I still think we should start. And I can welcome everyone for today's session that will be in English again, because we have international guests, or a international guest today. And I just probably should start by introducing those who contribute today, which will be Maria Castro, Felicitas Heßelmann, and Zara Daraike. I'm actually very, very happy again that we have a student discussant, Maria Castro, today. I thank you very much for taking up this job and discussing with us and discussing on camera. This is very much appreciated. I'm looking forward to your comments and to your contributions at the end of Sarah's talk. The other commentary will come from Felicitas Heßelmann, who I'm going to introduce with a few words. She studied sociology in Dresden and Mannheim. Her doctoral work deals with scientific misconduct, where she uses theoretical perspectives from criminology and science studies. Her dissertation is titled in German Die Bestrafung wissenschaftlichen Fehlverhaltens zwischen Selbstreinigung und autoritativer Sanktion, and was published last year. I would urge you to read it because it's fantastic work. Which I'm not just saying because I served as her doctoral advisor. It really is good. She has published a number of papers, not just on scientific misconduct, but also on valuation practices, visibility, and post-colonialism in science. With her current research project, she is at the Merton Center here and looks at automated digital algorithmic tools to detect scientific misconduct. And maybe as a little spoiler for this week, she will be featured in a press release from the Berlin University Alliance, which should be released tomorrow. Thank you, Felicitas, for taking up this job and being here and discussing, even though we just saw each other in many meetings, but that's just one more, which I find very, very pleasurable. And then I'm very happy to introduce our external guest today, which is Zara Daraike, who will give a talk to say a few words about her. She received her PhD with honors from the University of Groningen in 2010, and shortly afterwards joined the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University, the CWTS, that many of us will already know. She is there currently professor in science, technology, and innovation studies, and she's also the scientific director of the institute. Her expertise is in examining the interactions between science governance and knowledge creation. She has a strong international reputation in science and technology studies, with specific training and expertise in social studies of research evaluation. From that, you can already glance that some of the topics and themes that run through her work are evaluation studies, social theory, indicators as a topic, and the history of scientific objectivity. She has quite a number of advisory roles, contributory roles, editorial board roles in journals, which I'm not going through all of them, would take us probably a lot of time. She is very busy and very successful, let me testify to that. But I'm specifically going to mention that she's part of the author group of the Leiden Manifesto that has sometimes been discussed in some of the introductory courses in our study program. And from there, probably some of the students will already know your work. And maybe I'm also, because publishing and journals and peer review and open data and open science have been topics in this course, mentioned that you are not just a member of some editorial boards, but also in one of the core journals of our field, namely in Science, Technology, and Human Values, to give people some context what you do and where you're from. So thank you very much for being here, for giving us something to talk about afterwards. And I think that's what I'm going to start with. And now I'm looking forward for your presentation. Thank you, Sarah, for coming.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, and thank you for having me. I'll share my screen. We tested this, so it should be okay. Can you just confirm that you see it? That would be
perfect. We can see it very well.
So so I prepared a talk. I wouldn't mind if you intervene, although it might be harder to do because we're in this virtual format, but it's a relatively broad strokes, high fly presentation. And I'm also really looking forward to going into a bit more detail after I'm done. So I prepared it for a relatively mixed audience, but we can go in multiple ways also after the talk. I would be very happy to do that. So I would actually like to start with this quote that I really like and a book that I really like. And I wish I would have written it. I think it summarizes how I sit in academia. So it's from The Generous University, written by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. It's, I think, a fantastic book on how universities can become more generous, in which I think she charges us all with thinking constructively rather than competitively, and also with building new ideas and with building or listening over speaking, community over individualism, collaboration over competition. So that also, I think, is a start of a talk that will demonstrate that I not only am interested in doing empirical research and theorizing, but I'm also trying to intervene in making universities maybe a bit more generous. That's a nice term actually to use. So this is, I think, close to the work on social studies of evaluation that I do. And to illustrate that, I would like to use a quote in the next slide. I'll share a story with you. And it's a story that led to a big project that I'm now leading on evaluation in ocean science. And it started all with an email that I received from a marine biologist from Italy. So he is located in the Italian evaluation system. But I think what he describes is a more a broader issue. His name is Nando Buero, and he wrote to me after he had written he read an article that I wrote together with Ruth Muller. She's in Munich, one of our STS colleagues. He wrote after reading that he was quite frustrated because he was basically unable to publish his findings in the key journals in his fields. While he was used to doing that and was successful in it, it didn't work anymore. And he studies the occurrence of swarms of jellyfish, so jellyfish blooms. Why we see very high numbers of bloom periods in recent years. Which isn't a really trivial thing, because these rising numbers of blooms are an important indication that the ecology of the seas and oceans are disturbed. So he got in touch and basically wrote a very angry email. My article, or our article, had confirmed that science is not being properly evaluated today. So he mentioned strict norms in his field, how they are being translated into the national science system in Italy. And he wrote that as an established researcher, he often collaborates and he works on policy reports, but that it would actually harm his university if he would include those reports as output in evaluations, because they're not published in international peer-reviewed journals, have no journal impact factor. I think most of you may know what that is, but the impact factor that's used to measure the importance basically of a journal by calculating the number of times selected articles are cited within the last few years. So he wrote this, but I want to make clear that this output is much more valuable than anything I have published in my career to date. However, the current evaluation mechanisms do not assess its true value. I've written manuals for students, given scientific advice to policymakers, but this counts for nothing in the academic world. I also don't add my name unnecessarily to articles written by colleagues, and so my publication numbers are decreasing. According to the current evaluation criteria, I'm lazier now than I was in the past. So this is a very explicit framing. It's also very black and white. It's also the way he speaks. I gotten to know him a little bit. But I think the gist of the points that he makes are much more commonly felt and more widely felt. So, so because I study research evaluation, do social studies of research evaluation, I treat that kind of material as also source material and also as a reason to do further research. So in my work, I'm interested in how all that evaluation and rating, ranking has come about. Want to know how evaluations also affect scientific research. And as Martin said, and I also, I think, repeated at the start, I'd like to do a combination of activities there. So do research, but also outreach activities. So this is a comment by Phil Ball. He's a science writer and editor of Nature. And he describes how science has changed over the past century toward more team science, big science, toward fulfilling its social contract by confronting issues of global reach and existential urgency, as he calls it, including climate breakdown and also with some foresight here, epidemics. And I put that up here because I think it's one of the signals. So I think we've all seen that there's an accumulation of discussions of how science goes wrong, basically, in the broader public media for around, I think, 7 to 10 years or so now. And this was, I think, part of a feature series about science that he contributed to and also edited. So you also have a quote here. Ball, many other pundits, they signal important changes to the institutions that underpin research. They signal it, and I think many of us here also study that. So what type of changes are we referring to here? So changes in the way we communicate research. The question of can papers and can monographs and other formats still contain the research results of today? But we're also not only talking about communication, but also peer review. A lot of discussion about the uses and misuses and the productivity and improductivity of peer review, but also the evaluation systems at large. So do these systems of credit work to acknowledge the diversification of roles in research, the diversification of missions and the expectations on the shoulders of researchers to not only be excellent, but also to solve all kinds of grand challenges? Are these systems of credit working to facilitate and foster that or not? So I guess that's one of the interests I have. Find it also fascinating and try to keep that kind of maybe anthropological strangeness or sense of strangeness when we look at these practices of evaluation becoming so prominent in the context of universities. And of course, it's harder and harder to make that strange because we live in a wider evaluation society, as Peter Dahler Larsen called it in his book with that title. So we're surrounded by these types of practices of rankings and ratings and mobile phone apps that you can rate and rank everything on, basically. So that had really increased with the advent of the internet and with platform capitalism and all these types of trends. And universities are also part of that. So I'm interested to study how that came about, these practices of assessing academic work, and also how they interact with practices of knowledge production. So that is, yeah, sometimes, yeah, you can refer to it as doing analyses on the shop floor level to also really understand what happens under the radar that you wouldn't be able to trace with more scientometric means, for instance, that look at codified practices. But actually, I think when we consider what we do and analyze, and what I think a couple of you in the audience, in the room, virtual room as well, are doing, is not looking at evaluation in the strict or narrow sense, but also make a connection between knowledge creation on the one hand and the management and organization of science and scholarly work on the other. So in the broader sense, management and organization of science. And that is, I think, really important to do, because there have been major changes, for instance, in the funding structures in the past decades. So I've listed two, but there are many more. So we see a move towards more competitive forms of funding, and more recently also a move to mission orientation in the funding landscape. So what you see, for instance, in the EU is that it's tackling societal priorities, or wants us to tackle those via funding that targets global challenges. And these moves are not necessarily endorsed by everyone. It depends on where you sit in the system, I guess. Critics of that move to missions are, for instance, afraid that that will lead to a further reduction of financial support and other forms of support, maybe also infrastructural support for more fundamental research. So there's a lot of activity and promotion of interdisciplinary work, transdisciplinary research, open research, societally relevant research. But at the same time, that is causing frictions with what you could call, with David Stark's term, other evaluative principles, other criteria for scientific quality, such as excellence that has been stimulated for the past 25 to 30 years in science policy, but also international competitiveness, also one of the evaluative principles. Other changes that I have here are an increasing formalization of scientific work that might actually also be related to this shift in more competitive funding, so that there's an added layer of accountability in place. So you also see that there are more short-term projects, and that these projects are also often associated with very strict project management and control mechanisms. And as you can imagine, those factors play a certain role in how researchers obviously do their work and plan their work, and maybe also publish their work. What I think we might not have a discussion about here, but what we have to keep in mind is that evaluations are really social processes to the core, and that's because they're intimately connected to, for instance, funding structures, but also organizational forms. Think of institutions, national science systems, evaluation systems, political systems, and other social systems. So that is one of the reasons why it is totally imperative that we have social scientific research to understand how evaluations work in the real world, I think. And also because they have constitutive potential. So that's a fancy way of saying that they shape these knowledge production practices that are, I mean, probably, yeah, people would hope to be simply assessing those and not necessarily also simultaneously recognizing that measuring something is also an intervention. So once you start measuring or tracking someone's activities, they will probably respond by trying to adapt their behavior. And that's also not necessarily a bad thing. It's also something that is built into these systems to affect change. So what we look at in my group are, I guess, three central questions. So how does all this work? How do we evaluate science and scholarship? and which ideas about quality or changing ideas about quality or a relevance of research or ideas about what good governance is or the importance of something like competition or collaboration do we see in these formal evaluation systems and also informal evaluation processes. And the second question is, how do evaluations interact with science and scholarship itself? So how do they affect decisions that researchers, for instance, make about which direction to take, who to collaborate with, how to organize their work, and also where to publish it, who to publish it for, who the audiences are. And then also that more, I guess, normative question about, is this really how we want to value and evaluate research? And I think you can tell by some of the activities that Martin mentioned that I'm not necessarily saying a wholehearted yes to this question, because I do think there are some flaws in the system that we need to work on. And that is also quite a natural thing that we have to continue to work on that. It's one of the principles in the Leiden Manifesto that I think some of you have seen, that you need to update your evaluation systems and the criteria in there regularly, because the system itself is also changing. And people respond to the evaluation criteria, but the system itself is also changing. So quite fundamentally, as Philip Ball also, I think, wrote in the editorials. So we have globalization, researchers increasingly working with large-scale infrastructure. There's also expectations that may even exceed the problem-solving capacity of science, for instance, when it comes to finding solutions for very big societal problems that we are working on, we as an academic community, but they are huge. They're huge. Healthy aging, ethics, artificial intelligence, climate breakdown. So this is, I think, one of the reasons why I think it's really crucial that we understand how evaluations can and also do influence the behavior and choices of researchers and universities. So what they are doing now, but also some of our work is more historical, not as much as I'd hope, maybe. I'd also like historical work, but what they did in the past is also important. And the question of what we want them to do. So when I came to CWTS 10 years ago, that element of studying the shop floor dynamics, arguably something that STSers, science and technology studies researchers, are well trained in, was maybe not as present. So that is, we saw an opportunity to start doing that. And then from the institutional context that Martin described, so CWTS was and still is a large scientometric center. So we built in basically in the research agenda the friction between building metric infrastructures and also studying them with an ambition to learn from both of these activities and to build a knowledge base with empirical research on this interaction between metrics and evaluation and knowledge creation on the shop floor. So we started to really look at indicators 10 years ago, also because, well, they were, I'm saying were because it's not necessarily, it's a very different landscape now, at least in Northern Europe, I think, and definitely in the Netherlands. We can talk about that maybe after the talk, but metrics were often seen as the appropriate road to take in assessing quality, research quality. But we were really interested to see how this works in practice. And I guess looking back, an important conclusion from the projects that we did was that there's a dominant thinking in terms of market economics in universities that we were allowed access to. And these types of economical ways of thinking in evaluation contexts sometimes reduces the question about the value of knowledge or values of knowledge to how efficient it is organized and what it brings, what it delivers, how productive it is. So how much have researchers published in a specific period with which journal impact factor of the journals in which they published, how many times were they work cited, how much money have they acquired in recent years. So all these things became marks of esteem. And that is not necessarily only bad, but there is, I think, an important consequence that I have here on the slide that you can, yeah, I think, question if that's something of a desirable effect. And that relates to the well-being of researchers in the system, or maybe the space for what we could call social elements. So consequences of increasing competition, decreasing collegiality, less commitment to the community. And we've been doing field work in different disciplines. Well, so we have now hundreds of interviews and many months of observations, a lot of documents that we analyzed. We started in the biomedical sciences, and I think some of you have heard me speak about that before. Because we started there because we saw that the pressures was so high in that area on, for instance, ambitious young researchers, that they didn't even think about going on holiday, because otherwise their work would perhaps be scooped by another group in another country. And we also saw that group leaders and heads of departments were warning each other about the health risks that they run by chronically working too hard. And I've used this quote that I'm showing now a couple of times in the talk. This was just to a head of department in a yearly appraisal with a head of division in molecular cell biology. And I was observing that yearly appraisal. So this is what they said to each other as a warning. So I've told you many times that you must also take care of your health. I should know I have had 3 bypasses. And there's really more to life than an article in Nature. I was really shocked at the time when I heard that. Yeah, I've unpacked it a little bit since then. It's also, yeah, there's also a lot of metaphors about going to war together and also fighting battles that also relate to the content of their work, I guess, and maybe also a bit of machismo, I don't know, but it's also really a serious issue, and it's with early career researchers, but also with the more established senior colleagues. So another important consequence, I think, in that system based on these market economics relates more to the content of the work. And I also think that that is an important point, and we need to do much more work on that, I think, also scientometrically, that we're observing a serious risk of a decline in the diversity of the subject matter that we can discuss in academic work. Because we're also observing that research is sometimes designed and adjusted in a way that it ensures a relatively safe or good score, not necessarily safe, a good score. That they're choosing research questions not just on the basis of interest or importance, but also to improve their chances of getting a job. So that's what Ruth and I have called thinking with indicators. And I think that is problematic for science as a whole, because we can see that other criteria for scientific quality, such as originality or scientific progress in the longer term, or societal relevance, are disappearing into the background, or maybe even becoming unthinkable in the first place. So I think what we have is a set of findings that point to what Max Vogler in his work referred to a narrowing of evaluative registers. So a couple of the things that are very dominant are here on the slide. Researchers are required to engage in international mobility, competition, and in entrepreneurialism, and to undergo periodic application, selection, and assessment procedures where their academic worth is assessed, and that's done in an act of comparison. So that form and format of doing that and comes also with certain ranking and rating practices that also can be analyzed. And what's often happening is also, and that's also a broader societal trend, that people are increasingly working under time-limited contracts in patchworked academic careers. So sewing together basically one small contract after another, or next to each other even, if you're lucky to get positions. So the big question we, I think, have is, what are the effects of all this on the institutional fabric of research, and also on the work itself? So I mentioned that email from the Italian marine biologist Nando Buero in the beginning also ultimately led to this project on evaluating ocean science. Here you see the people that are working with me on that. And yeah, because of that email, I started to think about ocean science as, I guess, a perfect case, because it has elements. So analytically, it's interesting. It's also interesting because it's, for me, it was of unfamiliar territory, but it's also a field or a set of fields that represent, I think, what's going on in many other fields. They're under great pressure to be scientifically excellent, but also to collaborate with industry and to produce things, instruments, for instance, that are also relevant for industry. And they are also looked at for contributing to saving the planet, the future of the planet, in that whole climate breakdown. Big problem that we have. Oceans are a very, very important factor in the health of the Earth. And so here I think I was interested in, how do they, if at all, work to do all that and work to navigate these different evaluative registers, if you like, and how does formal evaluation come into play here? Does that help them, or doesn't it? That email that I received suggests that there may be issues, that there may be certain disciplines like marine biology that are suffering, maybe at the expense of other disciplines within that larger umbrella of ocean science. So what does that look like? And is that not something to take note of and to study more carefully, and maybe also to raise our voices about? So basically what you see here is a very short summary of the project, and a simplification. But I hope you bear with me here. So we're looking at the past, basically through what went through peer review, what type of research priorities in ocean science did we see until now. So that is a quantitative part of this project. So which lines of inquiry became hot topics, which lines died out, can you see global players emerge, who ended up in the periphery, who published on what, did you see certain types of interdisciplinary collaborations pop up? So those types of questions we're interested in. And then the second part of that project looks at the currently evolving landscape of what matters in ocean science. As you can imagine, that part has suffered tremendously from the pandemic. And I'm really sad that that happened. The idea was that we would have a team of PhD candidates that would go out and do field work with ocean researchers wherever they were going. So maybe on beaches, but also on ships, etc., to study and analyze the knowledge cultures in different European marine institutes, and to also really study this institutional fabric in conjunction with the knowledge production practices on the shop floor. So the daily practices of doing research. But we've had to shift gear quite substantially here, because we couldn't embark on that field work. So we're doing a lot of digital work at the moment, and they're managing, but of course they're also a bit sad that they didn't, as of yet, go out and do field work. And the third part of that project is looking more at the future. So that looks at priority setting in science policy, with the idea that we can then study what types of expectations around the role of ocean science are formulated, again, in the European policy landscape. So which values and priorities will ocean science be held accountable to in the near future, and how do policymakers and also ocean scientists collaborate or not? When does that type of collaboration fail? Yeah, so this comes back to that point about what I think our ambitions are, or what I think our assignment is. So not only to analyze these conditions for conducting research, so the management and organization of research, but also the developments in the content of the work. And also, yeah, I think that requires a more fundamental question about notions of quality that are present or have been present in academia, but also looking closely at our own role as a regulatory science. I will say a bit more about that in a minute. And I think we need to really also scrutinize, and I think we also try that, to look at our own roles as scientometricians or as researchers on research evaluation, and also how we can become responsibly, I guess, engaged analysts. So the picture you see here is a bit of a joke. So the guy says, no, we just study it. Your job is to go out and do it. I didn't think that was something we would be able to or should say. I think we need and also do make our hands dirty. So probing this notion of quality, again, broad strokes, but I guess what we are unpacking all the time is, so what do you see in policy, for instance? How is it defined, or is it not defined at all? When someone says excellence, or when we operationalize excellence in policy, how meaningful is that? How do we interpret that? There is an ambulance coming. I'll wait a second. Yeah, so it's gone now. And what do we consider to be high quality research? How is that done in different contexts? Do we mean excellence? Do we mean highly cited? Where are certain notions operationalized or not? Is proper knowledge done by geniuses versus bad apples? So is it located in an individual or not? I guess not anymore, but we still have remnants of that kind of thinking in the way we organize our assessments and career trajectories located in individual dynamics. And well, when you see shifts towards more team work or team science, again in policy, big policy push here as well. What does that mean for how a notion of quality is operationalized, or how does that trickle down or not? Good knowledge, is that open knowledge? When is it better to have it closed? Is that a methodological operationalization of quality, or is it broader? So all these things are really interesting, I think, also to analyze. And yeah, and the same applies to measurement. So this is what we've, as I said, focused on quite intensely and are still also doing. So really looking at what is actually highlighted and furthered by using certain forms of measurement, and what isn't, what is beyond the street lights, what is not made visible, and how can we make sure that we don't marginalize inadvertently very important things, parts of the social sciences and humanities, or maybe more regionally relevant activities. So these types of points you may also recognize from the points in the Leiden Manifesto. And yeah, so for this kind of work, the conceptual and also the analytical and methodological tools of the social sciences and humanities are actually absolutely critical. So I think there's maybe a little bit of a tendency, at least in my part of academia, for social sciences and humanities to primarily focus on becoming harder sciences. So I was trained in psychology, and in the Netherlands that is modeled on what they think is solid natural science work. It's a lot of lab work, a lot of statistics. So a certain form or notion of objectivity fares well in that kind of context. But in my view, the social sciences and humanities should not primarily focus on becoming harder. They must become more engaged, actually, to be more meaningful. You can still do that through quantitative means, but I don't think we can get away with that stance about mechanical objectivity doing all the work for us with numbers that don't do anything, or decisions that are made by someone else. So that's the point also about these regulatory sciences. I think that's a term by Sheila Jasnoff, but I'm not sure. So under which I include STS, but also evaluation studies, scientometrics, that they have an obligation because they work together with policymakers, for instance. They feed decision making. So they have an obligation also to seek out this engagement and to step to make their hands dirty also explicitly. Yeah, so scientometrics is an obvious candidate to say something about that, because it's from the outset not a neutral party, but it's deeply involved in producing indicators that also serve as policy instruments. Yeah, so I think that is an added responsibility to the field that it has to offer solutions also for future orientation when the world changes around us as well, and also in response to scientometrics sometimes. Yeah, final two slides are about relevance and applicability. I guess what for me is important, or I hope this is what it does, the work on how science interacts with evaluation. I hope it gives insights into how research ambitions and research policy turn out in practice. I also hope it produces knowledge about the role played by evaluation in the everyday work of researchers and other stakeholders, as we then say. And I also hope, but I'm sometimes also disappointed in that, that we didn't succeed. I also hope that it may be beneficial for the researchers that we study. For instance, by helping them or trying to mutually understand how terms such as excellence or relevance are used, and how can we use them in a more responsible way. What does that mean in different fields, and how can we, with our work, also help yeah, a certain adoption that's not indiscriminately using these terms because we need to. Yeah, so the ambition is also that we help this reflection on how local contexts partly determine what is meant by responsible research, what values are embedded in certain communities, and what questions and problems are relevant and appropriate for the skills and interests of their researchers. And I've put that up there because what we see a lot in our institute when we help research groups, for instance, think about an evaluation procedure and what would be good to highlight. There is sometimes a tendency to adopt, or a need to adopt, this frame of excellence, and that creates a situation in which people think there's one way and one notion of doing that, and it's much harder to really sit down and consider what's our purpose on this earth, basically, and what type of criteria fit with that purpose and the people and the instruments that we have on the shop floor. Final slides is indeed, yes, some of this more outreach type of activity. I'd like to mention the one on the top left, because some of you may have heard that there's now this movement in the Netherlands on recognition and reward. It's a very fascinating time. So a knowledge coalition of all the universities, all the medical centers, and the major funders in the Netherlands have come together and wrote this position paper that we need to install more responsible research assessment. That is basically what it does. So more quality over quantity, more teamwork, appreciation of teamwork, more open science, appreciation of those types of practices. And every university now has a steering group that tries to translate those ambitions into their local context. And I'm co-chairing one of those for Leiden. And it's a very complex process, despite the fact that or maybe because of the fact that I've been studying it. So sometimes, yeah, it's sometimes, yeah, very complicated when you're really in the middle of it and when it's your own university. So we can talk about that as well, but I'll stop here and open up the floor for the commentators and your own questions. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for this really inspiring presentation. And I think I would move straight to Maria's comment. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I would also like to thank you for this presentation. It was very, very interesting. I learned a lot. I have 4 pages of notes to show for it. And yeah, I mean, I have read the text for this session and prepared a lot of questions, which tie a lot with the presentation. And yeah, I would like to address that. First of all, from a student perspective, which I think is very interesting. Of course, I don't speak for all students, but I think that many of my questions might also be the questions of other students that couldn't maybe think of the same questions right now, or maybe we're not able to ask them directly. So yeah, I'd like to start with the funding of higher education institutions, which can be connected to their performance, international competitions. And once again, this whole competitive scenario comes forth, and it seems to be very present throughout the text. And certain areas of the university personnel are heavily affected by this. But I was also wondering, what about the students? How can this funding, or lack thereof, result in a more competitive because one could argue that more competition would, to get into bigger and more renowned universities for one, could be one of these consequences for students. But is there more to it than one might expect at first glance for students?
I'm sorry, Maria, you dropped out very briefly while you were asking your question. So the final part, maybe you could repeat, if you don't mind.
I was just, sorry about that. My internet is kind of crazy lately.
We all have that.
But basically, at first one could argue that this lack of funding could impact the students' decision to enter certain universities or not. But that is just one particular aspect of this difficulty or maybe impact of funding on higher education and so on. So yeah, is there more to it than one might expect at first glance? How are students impacted by this, and so on?
Yeah, so I'm going to rally in the troops here, because there may be other people that know as much or not more about this one. So thank you very much for that really good question. I'm doing that disclaimer because we haven't done research on that. But what I do think, that's really a good point, that maybe the lack of funding might also affect choices students make about what type of environment would be conducive to their desires for going to university A or not, if I understand you correctly. What I also imagine is a relevant point. I don't know what it looks like in Germany, for instance, but in the Netherlands we see this casualization of labor. So the people that you see in front of the class are not necessarily treated well. So they have a lot of temporary contracts. We are for instance, in the Netherlands, trying to work against that, but it's a big discussion. We have a lot of strikes at the moment because of this. There's a casualization of labor, specifically in the education part of universities. So the work is building, and people, when they have or are successful, for instance, in gaining external grants, so I'm talking about the professors, for instance, then they buy themselves out of teaching, and a temporary person comes in to cover for the other person. So you get this whole temporary casual labor type skill around the permanent staff. And that is a very problematic development, I think, because there is a desire with these persons to actually stay in academia, but not necessarily a place for them. And they also are unsure about the types of requirements that they need to fulfill to perhaps be able to stay. And I think, but I haven't studied that, I think that might also affect, I'm not sure how, because I don't have the data, but I think that might affect interactions with students and the number of hours people have to actually do teaching. So in that sense, I think it does trickle down and affect the world of students as well. But please, others that have looked into this, step in if you want.
So there seems to be a general lack of research on that topic, which I agree is very, very interesting and would be very worthwhile to study and to understand a bit better.
Yeah,
maybe I can.
Sorry. Yeah.
I just
Please
wanted to
do.
add sort of a little morsel, because you had the street lamp on one of your slides.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the unintended effects or perverse effects of research evaluation, that we evaluate what we can evaluate. And it's easy to evaluate research because you can count papers and citations, but it's difficult to count sort of teaching performance. So we're substituting sort of in the evaluation regime research for teaching, and thus sort of make the context more difficult for teaching just because it's more difficult to measure. I think that's probably one of the general aspects I would say about sort of this whole landscape.
Yeah, so that's a good point as well. And when we do measure teaching, it's I don't know if that happens in Berlin as well, but we have very problematic rating systems in Dutch universities. And yeah, one of the things that maybe I should also clarify is that CWTS is not enrolled in bachelor and master programs. So so we don't experience that ourselves. It might also explain why we are maybe sometimes forgetting that that's also an interesting topic for study. But good that you raised it again.
Yeah, just before we jump into other questions, I'd like to also comment on that. It's interesting that you mentioned strikes and all of that, because I'm from Brazil, and usually higher education, renowned higher education is actually tied a lot to public education, public universities and so on. And there are a lot of strikes going on there, which of course have impacted the maybe not the quality of teaching, but definitely the life of students, because they take a little bit longer to actually finish their studies, or they might not feel like the university environment is very reliable, and that of course has impacts on the students themselves. And over the course of this year, I believe there also has been talking of closing down one of Brazil's biggest universities, UFRJ, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which is very, very sad and you know, very bad. Well, so yeah, I mean, there is maybe something here to be studied, not only in European universities in general, but also worldwide. It could also be an interesting factor to study, maybe.
Yeah, it's one of the so it's great. It's also a good point. One of the things that this recognition and rewards program in the Netherlands is trying to address. I wonder how it will play out. So one of the things that we see happening is that there's a more explicit rewarding of teaching activities by for instance, also appointing and promoting professors that mainly do teaching. Because as Martin says, this streetlight effect has created a situation in which people were just simply promoted on the basis of, well, the measurable types of activities. But there's a lot of discussion around what that will actually do and how that will really play out, because some people are skeptical because that will maybe create this two-tier system in which there's still a perceived or actual hierarchy between the professors that do all the international sexy stuff and then the professors that do all the teaching, which is by some accounts not as sexy. We of course don't agree, but that's the kind of hierarchy that is really in place, sadly enough.
I'd like just to make a quick addition. I don't know if it was clear, the fact that the Brazilian university that I was talking about, they are talking about closing it because of lack of funding, which I guess ties really well with the rest of the question, just to make that clear. We can go to the other question right now.
So I see there are already some questions from the audience. Maybe before we open the floor to audience questions, I would also like to add just a very quick question. In your presentation, you talked about this shift from this focus on excellence to more mission-oriented evaluation goals. and or societal impact as a new goal that is now evaluated. And I found that very interesting and fascinating because you spoke about it quite critically, maybe. But also I know that this whole notion of excellence has also been heavily criticized. I mean, especially in Germany, if you think about the excellence initiatives, there has been a very, very vocal debate about the specific term and the idea behind it. And this got me thinking, maybe in your opinion, or what would you say, is everything with evaluation systems just continuously going kind of from bad to worse? So is there even such a thing as a good evaluation system, or are they just all bad, just in very unique ways?
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I realized that my microphone was on all the time, so you heard me laugh already. But no, that's a really, really interesting question. I will start by explaining myself a bit better, because maybe I didn't do that in the discussion, in the talk, because what I wanted to say is that there are some critics of this move, but it's not necessarily me. I'm just fascinated by these shifts and how they are interacting or clashing with each other, and how people respond to that. So interviews that we are now doing with leaders in ocean or marine institutes, you see that they are shifting their institutional research agendas to also accommodate for these more mission-oriented questions and approaches. And I guess the question for me is interesting. So why is that happening? How is it happening? When is it happening? Is it happening, or is it mainly something that people describe in their mission on a website, or is there actually something going on in the research as well? But there is, of course, steering through the availability of forms of funding. A couple of our projects have looked at how this regime of excellence has played out in research groups, and that's a very short version of what I wanted to say. But I guess I still have, so your second question, I think it is possible to make productive changes, because otherwise I would not sit on a steering committee to affect change or write this Leiden manifesto, although I did get a lot of credit for that as well, which is ironic, obviously. But anyway, I think I don't think it's gotten from bad to worse. I think I treat it more analytically, so there may be good things or bad things. We can steer it a little bit in our local context. What fascinates me is this layer that is added in the last decades with this emergence of scientometrics and also performance indicators. And our institute has in the Netherlands played a quite fundamental role in changing that landscape in the Netherlands. So I'm really interested how that then results in forms of policy in which indicators start to play a role, but also how researchers themselves adopt indicator thinking, and then what the consequences of that are epistemically. That is always the driving force. But I don't think it's gotten from bad to worse. It depends on the context, maybe. In the Netherlands, I don't think should complain too much, because we don't have a direct link with between funding and evaluation. All kinds of indirect links, but we still are in the fortunate position of having this orientation towards learning and less on accountability and punishing in our assessments. Does that answer your question, or were you expecting something else?
No, it does. And obviously, I'm glad to hear that there's still room for some optimism somewhere there.
It's not a bleak picture, hopefully, only, yeah.
So then I'd like to open the floor for the questions, and I think Sibylle Hinze raised her hand first.
Hello.
Hi, Sarah. I'm coming off the off.
Hi, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too. Of course, I have many questions, but I will kind of reduce my curiosity to one to start with, and that's the discussion we just briefly touched upon at the end. This is this kind of, I'm not sure, but whether it's constructed or whether it's there, this kind of contradiction between excellence and mission, because I don't really see that there is a contradiction per se. For me, this mission orientation is more like a way of priority setting from a kind of content point of view, rather than an assessment criteria as such. I think also within these missions, you can conduct excellent work and be awarded for that. So how do you deal with this kind of differentiation in your new schema? And the second question is, how do you do this at the individual versus the organizational level? Because there are different levels. I think one has to approach differently.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so let me start with the first one. That's a very interesting point, and I guess my attempt to an answer would be that the funny thing about policies for excellence, I think, is that they are so empty, that they don't steer and prioritize when it comes to substance, or like the content of the work. And the difference with this mission orientation is that it does. That's what you also say, right? It forefronts certain topics over others. And that makes some people nervous, because they have the feeling that they then don't have the room anymore to do curiosity-driven work. And in some way, we've been trained to think that is associated with more highly esteemed work. It has a long tradition, I guess. So in terms of how the policies operate, I think you do see a clear difference between excellence policies and mission-oriented policies. That's probably not correct English. I totally agree with your maybe hope that it's also possible to do excellent research in mission funding programs that do mission orientation. But then we really need to get rid of this idea that is kind of a second tier type of funding. And we need to get rid of the fact, so that is a change that I would like to see when we talk about affecting positive change, right? And I think maybe your question also alludes to that, or it's my interpretation, that that we then don't, at the individual level, in hiring or promotion procedures, forefront this other type of funding over consortium type collaborations that do really indeed excellent research that contributes to societal goals. So that's one of the things that I would be an advocate for. Maybe your second question was more methodological, about these different layers in the project, right?
Are you actually addressing both layers in your new schema, or are you focusing on the individual level more?
No, we're actually focusing on the institutional level more. So what we are trying to do is to it's very hard, as you probably know much better than I do, but we're trying to do a field delineation exercise first. What is ocean science in the first place? That's very complex and it's taking a lot of time. But the idea is that we then try to describe the history of the development epistemically of institutions in Europe, in marine institutes in Europe, to see how research topics and priorities have evolved, and how they, so through interviews, for instance, how they also respond to this emerging policy landscape in their priority setting at the institutional level. So that is the ambition, and I think, yeah, most of our work has tried to do that, but we've never tried systematically to combine scientometrics with ethnography, and it has been complicated because of also the pandemic, but that is the node in which we are mostly interested in.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Then I have Stefan on my list.
Yeah, thank you for that talk. It was very inspiring.
Oh,
And one thing that I stumbled over is your term of the engaged expert. And I took down engaged in what? Formulating the broader political project of accountability. And I'm not sure I get this the right way, because to me, this sounds like it could either be breaking down the territories between policymakers and analysts, because they like to point at each other. One says it's science, and the other says, yeah, we are evaluating those big programs. So they seem to be pretty happy about that situation. Is that what's being broken up, or is this some kind of shift that goes a different way? For instance, how and who are selecting these analysts? So is it shifting the power somewhere else? Because then it could be old Chomsky style manufacturing consent arguments. So you are in this position because you're talking the right language. And maybe finally, and I think most pressing in terms of the title of your talk is the responsibility issue. So who will be responsibility for what in this entangled constellation where I understand the point that the myth of the expert who looks from a ivory tower perspective at something, but I would be interested in your thoughts about what are the consequences of that. So these were many questions. I was not very disciplined. I'm sorry about that. But you get what I think you get where I'm playing at.
Yes, and I'm also still struggling with this. What is this indeed? What I'm saying, because I think it's also a personal, maybe a personal history point that I arrived at CWTS coming from a position that was always at the sideline critiquing. So that was what I was trained to do, and it's not, well, it's a bit of a shortcut, because I actually was trained in a group that was also on the barricades for instance, book publishing in psychology. But I think it partly relates to that point about institutionally trying to get that point across that you just made about, well, we cannot simply maintain that we are objective bystanders and that decision making happens somewhere else, because what we do as scientometricians or as evaluation experts does intervene, and we also in a sense think it does, but we don't recognize that it does, because well, we are increasingly comfortable saying that there's ethics around this type of work, but then we have to educate users to do this better, and that type of position is also an engagement with the practice. But I think what I would like is that we take one step further, and that we also account for our own positions, not only from the perspective of the expert and the teaching mode when we try to talk about responsible uses, but also analytically and in practice take into account that we ourselves also don't know a lot either. So it's a construction practice. So an evaluation is a construction. You do this together with the people that are analyzed. So it's more symmetrical. That's an STS point. I'm uncomfortable when the bibliometric community says, okay, there's ethics about this use of indicators, there's misuse, and if we explain it better, if we stand on the barricades, then all will be well. That's why I'm partly also uncomfortable with the Leiden Manifesto. Because
okay.
Yeah.
Because I would have played
I saw you look. Yeah, I saw you look. So for me, the manifesto is not that. For me, this is an intervention that helps us to have this other discussion. But clearly, it will also be read in that way that I just dismissed a little bit. But it's a step in the process, I think. So the things we're trying to develop at CWTS now, when we are working with research groups that are under evaluation, is that we also make more explicit what our own analysis does in the process. And we are not there yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to best do that, but it's not by producing an annex with bibliometric results and then saying, okay, you cannot use it like this, you can only use it like that, good luck.
But then it's an empowering project for analysts. So you're shifting power towards yourself.
I don't know, maybe, yeah. In a way, maybe, yeah.
Okay, we have 2 more questions from students, and I think Rocio raised her hand first.
Hello. I can't hear you yet. Maybe you're on mute?
Sorry. Now?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was a very interesting presentation. I just want to it's more a invitation, my question, so that you can talk a bit more about your project, because I find it extremely interesting, and I don't know if we had enough time, but if you can come up with some examples or some more details on your project. For all, I would be interested in knowing, what are you looking at when you say policy and evaluation mechanisms? Are you looking at funding agencies, public or private? Is it a global thing? Are you looking at all, like on your bibliometric data? Like, it's a lot. I don't know. And also in the funding, like, is global funding or like European funding, for example? Because if it's like, you know. And now with those things in mind, I was not, maybe it's an understanding thing, but could you give some examples of what you mean with excellence oriented evaluation and goal or mission oriented evaluation? Because from my understanding, or what I got from your presentation, excellence oriented would be like oriented towards high impact factor a type of output, or global competition in this type of metric. And mission oriented, I'm not sure if maybe you have some examples that you want to share, or are we talking about different forms of peer review or different metrics, or what is it that we're talking about, this type of thing? Yeah, just as example, if you already have something from your research, because I think it's really cool.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess to start with the last, because that builds on Sibylle's question, I think. Yeah. So I think you've summarized the excellence regime relatively well. So an example of mission-oriented programs, it is prioritization, as I think Sibylle said. So it's the installment of funding programs at European, but also not global, but I'm looking at European level and national levels, that ask of researchers or consortia that also not only include academic partners, but also partners, NGOs maybe, to address societal challenges such as healthy aging. But when it comes to ocean science, there are a lot of programs around blue growth. So that is revolving around smart uses of the oceans for economical purposes, which is something else than a program that would focus on climate change. And that would be different type of research. So what is interesting, I think, about this project is that there is this multiplicity of options and requirements for ocean researchers to address certain things, but they don't necessarily align. As I think I hope I've demonstrated with that quote from Nando Buero's work. Yeah, let's see. So examples, I guess what I tried to do in the proposal was to narrow it down to a European context. So the field work that we do is in Europe. When I wrote it, we didn't have Brexit yet. So I did sneak in British context. But for the scientometric analysis, we can go broader. But this is a question about delineation, indeed, about what do we need to do first? Do we want to chart the entirety of the space in which these researchers operate? That's not possible. But we're in the middle of carving out the boundaries of this field delineation that we do scientometrically. But the way in which I think I see the question around which types of funding we look at, it's an ethnographic orientation. So we have a couple of institutes in Europe that we collaborate with, and we only look at what funding appears in their context. So that would be an ethnographic approach. What's relevant for them becomes relevant to analyze. That said, there is, when we look at policy, there is in the ocean research community a very interesting European body. It's called the European Marine Board. And I was fascinated by that because it's bottom-up policy board, basically. It's started by European marine scientists themselves with the explicit purpose to intervene in policy at the European level. And I noticed when I was looking into ocean research that this is a relatively common infrastructure for ocean researchers to intervene in policy that I didn't yet encounter in the other disciplines that we studied at this level. So there's a lot of activity between ocean researchers and policymakers. And that means that we can also study these interactions. And that's what we do. So there's a whole archive of stuff that the European Marine Board did over the past 25 years. And they've digitized a lot, so that's really interesting. We're interviewing them, and we're looking at what are they trying to really influence right now. What I wrote down, and that I think relates back to Stefan's question about engaged analysts. One of the things I wrote in the application was that we also had the ambition to in that space where they collaborate between policymakers and the researchers, to also write something together, write a position paper or a policy document together, when we felt that our knowledge about evaluation practices could contribute to a discussion. So only if that happens, we might consider doing that. If not, okay as well, then we don't engage in the analysis. But if there is relevance of doing this, then we are open to doing it. Does that help? Does that answer? Make it more concrete? Sort of.
I guess you would have the answers in a couple of years.
Yeah, it takes a while. Yeah.
Okay, in the meantime, there is a further question by Florian.
Hi, and thanks, Sarah, again. Really interesting talk. Hi. And yeah, my question is going in a very similar direction as Stefan's. And I think there's an additional layer to this because scientometrics for the last like 10, 15 years has tried to establish itself as a field of expertise and demarcate the lines of its expertise. And now you're inviting them to be engaging analysts and engaging with the people and objects they are evaluating. And I was wondering how these two mechanisms, one of exclusive expertise and the other of inviting people into the evaluation, might play out.
Yeah, I'll get back to you on that in a couple of years as well. But no, it's fascinating. I'll tell you an anecdote. We are currently preparing our own institutional self-assessment. So in the Netherlands, you do that every 6 years. And we, on a national level, now have a new protocol to guide the process. It's called the Strategy Evaluation Protocol. And the idea is that you write a self-evaluation report that covers the past 6 years. What did you plan to do? How did it work out? How successful were you? But the labeling of strategy instead of standard evaluation protocol matters here because it now forefronts the strategic and, if you will, the mission of the work a bit more. And so what we did was we asked a couple of our own staff members to sit in a working group to help prepare this self-evaluation report. We just started, but it's interesting because you see this now in action. So we have this strategy evaluation protocol that gives you a bit of leeway, so you can use quantitative information in many different ways. You can still have an annex that says we had this and that number, but you can also use quantitative information to build a narrative around what you've done substantively. So over the past 6 years, we've invested in doing more research on X. And here you see the results, more descriptive visualizations, descriptive scientometrics. But it's not easy to actually have that land with our own staff. So people are just waiting for the qualitative people to finish, and then run their analysis. So yeah, for some reason I should have known that would happen, or there was a risk of that happening, but I didn't see it coming. I thought, well, they're going to work together and then magic will happen. But it's a bit more articulation work, and yeah, I hope we managed to make some steps here, because it would also help, I think, other groups, because it annoys me very much that there's this dismissive attitude around indicators, which I may have sometimes also contributed to, or people read it as such. That's not the point of what I'm trying to do, but there's this simplistic metrics use that I find problematic. But there's all kinds of, as you know very well yourself, all kinds of interesting things you can do with scientometrics that is not as well known, and that is at the risk of being thrown away with the bathwater. Is that an expression? Yeah. So, but that we would also maybe fall in that trap was a little bit of a surprise. But maybe we're still on time. Yeah. So not sure if I'm now answering your question, but I think this reflects of. I think it's fascinating because, indeed, as you say, there's this buildup of expertise and a certain position with scientometric well, expertise, indeed, and a position you take in the landscape. But at the same time, I think all of the people that do that are also very clearly knowledgeable about how much of that actually is an interaction between policymakers, for instance, and scientometricians. But for some reason, it's not easy to really acknowledge that when we are doing the work. So yeah, that is, I hope we can take some steps there. I think it would help, but I'm not sure. I hope so.
Yeah, and I imagine it would be easier within your own institute and with people knowing each other and being more engaged in a self-assessment kind of than when external and internal people have to come together and do the same work that you're doing right now. Yeah,
and it's also very pragmatic, I guess, because people are used to doing certain analyses and have never done this together. And it takes a lot of time and people don't have time. Yeah. I wonder what Sibylle wants to say, because she's jumping up and down almost.
Yeah, I see that there are a couple of more questions and opinions, maybe people getting emotional here. So it seems things are really getting started now, but in light of the time, maybe we have to close this kind of official part for the ones who have other appointments. And I would like to thank you very much for this inspiring talk again. And I would like to thank everybody who contributed. But I think I would also like to invite everybody to stay a bit more if they can, to witness the emotional discussion that's maybe going down from here on.
Let me just add my support to these wishes. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And if this becomes a thing that we continue these sessions afterwards, because there were sort of questions that overflow the usual time, that's a very nice thing to happen. And I just wanted to mention before those that want to leave already leave, our next meeting will be the coming Monday, June 14th. It will be about citizen science. We will have a very knowledgeable guest about this, Silke Voigt-Heuke from the Natural History Museum here in Berlin, who is, as an institution and individually, very proficient in things about citizen science. And as a commentator, we have one of the vice presidents from the Technical University, which is Christina Arendt. So lots to look forward for Monday. And those who want to leave, who want to enjoy the sun, please do. If Zara has another 5 minutes to answer Sibylle's question, the others can stay around.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for joining, everyone.
Not getting over emotional.
No, you're just setting up the expectations here.
No, I was just, I mean, I think I probably know your answer, but I still want to ask the question whether do you really expect that we will be at some stage able to develop an evaluation schema that kind of satisfies all expectations, like taking all the critics on board? Just making everyone happy. We are kind of trying, also discussing in a reflexive motion, the shortcomings and problems and options. But do you think that will kind of lead to something where we at some stage, even given the situation that you described at the beginning, that the system have to be adapted to the changes in the system, right? I mean, this is of course a situation that means changing all the time, or not within reason, within kind of periods of time.
Yeah.
Do you think that we will be able to kind of come to a situation where people say we are satisfied?
But highly unrealistic. Yeah. Yeah, I guess because there's always something at stake. So there will always be people that are not satisfied. But I guess what I would like is that I don't think we talked about that yet, but maybe it's implied in what I said, was that the evaluation processes are closer to the academics that are being assessed. So closer to acknowledging the effects on their epistemic practices, but also that they're more involved. Because that's one of the things that I think has happened, that it's this instrument of accountability that's at a distance, this trust in numbers argument that it helps certain people to translate things into numbers. It's good for policy making, for decision makers. But I think one of the ambitions I have is that the process is more closely connected and discussed with the people that are also being assessed. And of course, that's a big challenge because of time constraints, and people don't have time for that. And it's perceived as a bureaucratic exercise to begin with. That cannot be done in every context, I think, obviously, because some systems are not organized around this learning mode. It's more an accountability regime. But that would be a space in which I could see things improve for certain actors in the system.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether that isn't a shift, like from being assessed to negotiating the mission at the individual level and the responsibilities and the profile and stuff like this. So the criteria against which you are assessed, be it quantitatively or qualitatively. I mean, this is a completely different issue, but it's a negotiation process, also defining what your tasks are, from my perspective.
Yeah, but is that a problem?
No, but this could also be an endless story, right? I mean, you just discussed this with like research and teaching focus, and I mean, yeah, people buying out of teaching. I mean, I think it doesn't make things easier, just.
No, that's true. But I guess it's also a discussion about what's forefronted in an evaluation. Is that an efficiency argument? Do we need to do this quickly and cost efficiently? Or do we do this more irregularly, and do we really want to learn something from it? What's required for that? Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Stefan, if you really need to ask your question, even though we're over time.
Or make a point, make a beautiful last point.
Or make a point.
No, that's not my take, isn't it? I could,
think about,
but I don't.
Think about the start of Zara's presentation. It was about the generous university. So Zara has been very generous with her time. Let's try to be generous from our side as well. Oh, he saw that as he's not allowed to ask his question.
I would say it's a topic I really like to talk about. So it didn't feel like a burden at all. So it was really a pleasure.
No, but I'm somebody who tries to sort of stick to the time frames we usually agreed to, because you never know who's in here, who wants to participate, and who is on what constraints. And I think it's just sort of from a practical consideration, it's important to stick to time frames. Otherwise, you always have to ask permissions, which is problematic in and of itself. So thank you very much, Zara, for joining us, and thank you everyone else, and have a nice rest.